You're 36 years old, Mitchell. Most pilots start at 18. You think flipping burgers and mopping floors prepared you for combat aviation? Those were the words that cut through Sarah Mitchell like shrapnel as she stood in the humid Colorado morning, clipboard trembling slightly in her weathered hands. The base commander didn't know that in 72 hours, when every modern aircraft would fail and communications would go black, that same burger flipper would climb into the cockpit of an Apache helicopter everyone had written off as scrap metal. He didn't know that her calloused fingers, shaped by 18 years of thankless labor, would guide a machine through impossible terrain to save lives that Washington had already mourned as lost. And he certainly didn't know that by week's end, his own career would be under review while she'd be sitting across from Pentagon brass, trying to explain how a single mother from Denver, who'd never seen the inside of a flight academy, had just changed the course of a war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock shrieked at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 2 years since Sarah Mitchell traded her name tag collection for military fatigues. She rolled out of the narrow bunk at Fort Carson, her back protesting the government-issued mattress that felt like concrete, compared to the worn-out sofa she'd called home during those lean years in Denver. Her reflection in the small mirror showed the same face that had smiled through countless have-a-great-day exchanges at Rocky Mountain Diner, the same eyes that had stayed alert during graveyard shifts at QuickMart, counting down minutes until she could get home to help her kids with homework. But now those eyes held something different. Purpose, maybe. Or just the stubborn determination of someone who'd finally found something worth the early mornings. Sarah's journey to this moment hadn't followed any manual or career guidance pamphlet. At 18, when her classmates were shipping off to basic training or heading to college on their parents' dime, she was filling out job applications with a 2-month-old daughter on her hip and a high school diploma that felt more like a participation trophy than a ticket to anywhere meaningful. The father had vanished the moment pregnancy became reality, leaving Sarah to navigate single motherhood with the wisdom of someone barely old enough to vote and the bank account to match. The first job was at Rocky Mountain Diner, a grease-stained institution on Colfax Avenue, where truckers and shift workers gathered to complain about everything from the coffee to Congress. Sarah learned to balance plates up her arm like a circus performer, memorize orders without writing them down, and smile genuinely even when customers treated her like furniture. The tips were decent when she worked doubles, and the owner, Mrs. Chun, didn't ask questions about the baby sleeping in the back office during slow afternoon shifts. For 6 years, Sarah worked that job like it was her calling, showing up even when she had the flu, covering shifts for co-workers who called in hungover, and gradually earning the kind of respect that came not from a title, but from simply being dependable. But dependable didn't pay for childcare and rent and the endless stream of expenses that came with raising kids. So Sarah added a second job at QuickMart, working the evening shift after her diner hours ended. She'd change uniforms in the gas station bathroom, trade her coffee-stained apron for a polo shirt that smelled perpetually of fountain drinks and cigarettes. The work was different, but the skills transferred. Keep track of inventory, handle difficult customers with patience, clean up messes that weren't your fault, and always show up when scheduled. The gas station customers were a mix of commuters grabbing energy drinks before dawn and night owls buying lottery tickets with the desperate hope that comes with being broke at midnight. Sarah learned their stories without trying, the way you absorb the rhythm of a place when you're present enough to pay attention. There was Martinez, the construction foreman who bought coffee and aspirin every morning at 5:15, nursing hangovers from trying to forget that his back was giving out at 45. There was Jennifer, the nurse who stopped for cigarettes and energy bars during her double shifts at Denver General, fighting to stay alert while caring for patients whose insurance barely covered bandages. And there was old Pete, the veteran who came in every Thursday to buy a single beer and tell anyone who'd listen about flying helicopters in Vietnam. His hands still steady despite the tremor in his voice when he talked about friends who didn't make it home. Pete was the one who first mentioned that Sarah had good hands. She was changing the receipt paper in the register when he made the observation, watching her work with the kind of mechanical precision that came from doing small tasks correctly thousands of times. "You've got mechanic's hands," he said, nodding toward her fingers as they navigated the machine's inner workings without hesitation. "Steady, confident. My daughter's got hands like that. She fixes helicopters now, makes more in a month than I made in a year back when I was flying them." Sarah didn't think much of the comment at the time. She was focused on getting through each day, managing the careful balance of schedules and babysitters and the constant low-level stress of living paycheck to paycheck. But Pete kept talking, the way lonely old men do when they find someone willing to listen. He told her about learning to fly in the Army, about the precision required to keep a helicopter stable in combat conditions, about the mechanics who kept those birds flying when logic said they should fall apart. And slowly, without meaning, too, he painted a picture of a world where Sarah's particular combination of skills, patience, precision, reliability, and the ability to stay calm under pressure might actually be valued. The turning point came during her third job, cleaning offices at Metro Community Center 3 nights a week. Sarah was mopping the floors in the community room when she overheard a presentation being given to a group of middle-aged women. Speaker was a recruiter from the Colorado Army National Guard, explaining career opportunities for non-traditional candidates. Sarah paused her mopping, pretending to work near the doorway while she listened to descriptions of technical training, educational benefits, and the possibility of serving part-time while maintaining civilian employment. "We're specifically looking for people with strong work ethic and life experience," the recruiter was saying. "Military service isn't just for 18-year-olds anymore. Some of our best soldiers are people who've proven themselves in the civilian world first." Sarah found herself thinking about Pete's stories, about machines that required both technical skill and instinctive understanding, about the possibility of work that felt meaningful beyond just paying bills. The decision to visit the recruitment office took 6 months of internal debate. Sarah had to consider her kids, now teenagers who needed stability more than adventure. She had to think about leaving behind the only work she'd ever known, trading. The familiar challenge of making ends meet for the unknown challenge of starting over in her 30s. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't really starting over. She was finally starting. Basic training was both harder and easier than expected. Harder because her body, shaped by years of standing on concrete floors and lifting cases of soda, had to adapt to military physical standards. Easier because she'd already mastered the art of following instructions, working as part of a team, and maintaining focus during repetitive tasks. While younger recruits struggled with the discipline and structure, Sarah found military routine almost relaxing compared to juggling multiple jobs and single parenthood. The real revelation came during technical training. Sarah discovered that her years of fixing broken equipment at various jobs, from temperamental coffee machines to malfunctioning gas pumps, had taught her to think mechanically. She understood how systems work together, how to troubleshoot problems methodically, and how to maintain equipment properly to prevent failures. When instructors demonstrated helicopter maintenance procedures, Sarah's hands moved with the same confident precision Pete had noticed years earlier. Her first assignment was to Fort Carson, just an hour from the Denver neighborhoods where she'd spent 18 years scraping by. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was finally earning decent money and benefits while living close enough to visit her old jobs on weekends. Sometimes she'd stop by Rocky Mountain Diner to see Mrs. Chin, or waved to Martinez when she passed the QuickMart on her way to base. They seemed proud of her success, but also slightly puzzled, as if they couldn't quite connect the waitress they'd known with the soldier she'd become. At Fort Carson, Sarah was assigned to aviation maintenance, working on the fleet of helicopters that conducted training missions and provided support for National Guard operations. The work suited her perfectly. She had the patience for detailed inspections, the precision for delicate adjustments, and the reliability that supervisors valued above flashier qualities. But there was something else, something harder to define. When Sarah worked on helicopters, she seemed to understand them intuitively, anticipating problems before they manifested and knowing instinctively when something was wrong, even when diagnostics showed green across the board. It was Sergeant Tony Chun, no relation to Mrs. Chun from the diner, despite Sarah's initial assumption, who first suggested she consider flight training. Tony had been watching Sarah work for months, noting how she approached each aircraft like a puzzle to be solved rather than a machine to be serviced. "You've got the touch," he told her one afternoon as she completed a routine inspection on an Apache helicopter. "Some people work on these birds for years and never really understand them. You understand them." Sarah's response was automatic, conditioned by years of believing that opportunities like flight training were for other people with different backgrounds and better timing. "I'm 34 years old, Tony. Pilots start young. I've got 2 kids and a mortgage. I'm not exactly officer material." But Tony was persistent in the way that good NCOs are when they spot potential being wasted. He mentioned that the National Guard was actively recruiting older candidates for specialized positions, particularly in technical fields where life experience mattered as much as quick reflexes. He pointed out that modern military aviation relied more on systems management and decision-making than on the fighter pilot stereotypes from movies. And he reminded her that she'd already proven she could handle complex responsibilities under pressure. The conversation might have ended there, just another what-if moment in a life already full of them, except for the timing. Fort Carson was in the middle of a transition period, phasing out older aircraft in favor of newer systems and unmanned technologies. The IH-64D Apache helicopters that had been the backbone of the base's aviation capabilities were being systematically retired, replaced by more modern platforms and drone systems that required fewer pilots and promised lower operating costs. Sarah found herself assigned to the transition team, responsible for preparing the older Apaches for decommissioning. It was supposed to be straightforward work: inventory equipment, document maintenance history, prepare aircraft for either transfer to other units or sale to allied nations. But for Sarah, it felt like being asked to write obituaries for machines that still had life in them. The Apache she was assigned to oversee was tail number Army 0705438, a 15-year veteran that had seen deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan before returning to Fort Carson for training duties. The aircraft had been nicknamed Desert Storm by previous crews, a reference both to its combat history and to the way it seemed to materialize out of nowhere during exercises, appearing suddenly through dust clouds to deliver precise fire support. Sarah studied the maintenance logs like a biography, tracing the helicopter's service record through routine inspections, battle damage repairs, and the countless small modifications that accumulated over years of active use. What struck her most was how well-maintained the aircraft remained despite its age. Previous crews and maintenance teams had obviously cared for Desert Storm with the kind of attention that went beyond regulations. Every system was functional, every component properly serviced. The helicopter wasn't being retired because it was worn out or unreliable. It was being retired because spreadsheets said newer was better, because Pentagon analysts had decided that human pilots were becoming obsolete, and because budget pressures demanded efficiency over capability. Sarah spent her days documenting Desert Storm's specifications and capabilities, creating the paperwork trail that would justify its retirement. But she also spent time in the cockpit, familiarizing herself with the controls and systems that she might never have the chance to operate. It was during these unauthorized familiarization sessions that she began to understand what Pete had meant about the relationship between pilot and machine. The Apache wasn't just a collection of mechanical systems. It was a platform that responded to subtle inputs, that required intuitive understanding to operate effectively, that rewarded patience and precision over aggressive handling. The other soldiers assigned to the transition team treated their work as routine duty, something to be completed efficiently before moving on to more interesting assignments. But for Sarah, every day felt like a countdown to something irreversible. She was watching capable aircraft being discarded, not because they couldn't perform their missions, but because they no longer fit the military's vision of itself. It was a familiar feeling, the same sense of waste she'd experienced during her civilian years, when she'd watched good employees let go during corporate restructuring, when she'd seen functional businesses closed because they didn't meet quarterly profit targets. The difference was that this time, Sarah was in a position to do something about it. She had access to the aircraft, knowledge of their capabilities, and the technical skills to maintain them properly. What she didn't have was authorization to fly them, or any clear sense of when that capability might be needed. But instinct, shaped by 18 years of being ready for whatever came next, told her to prepare anyway. So Sarah began what she privately called her just-in-case training. During slow periods, she studied flight manuals and technical publications. She practiced emergency procedures on simulators, learning how to handle system failures and combat damage. She memorized performance charts and tactical procedures, building the kind of comprehensive knowledge that distinguished competent pilots from exceptional ones. Officially, she was preparing for possible future training opportunities. Privately, she was preparing for the possibility that someone, somewhere, might eventually need what she was learning to offer. Sarah's expertise with Desert Storm didn't go unnoticed, but the attention she received wasn't the kind she'd hoped for. Captain James Rodriguez had been watching her spend extra time with the Apache, noting how she lingered in the cockpit during inspections, and how she seemed to know exactly which maintenance panels to check without consulting technical manuals. Rather than seeing dedication, he saw insubordination. Rather than recognizing competence, he saw someone overstepping boundaries. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning while Sarah was performing what should have been a routine pre-retirement inspection. She was seated in the pilot's position, running through systems checks to verify everything was properly documented before the aircraft's final grounding. The cockpit felt natural under her hands, each switch and control positioned exactly where instinct suggested it should be. She was absorbed in the work, noting how responsive the flight controls remained despite the helicopter's age, when Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "Sergeant Mitchell, step away from that aircraft immediately." His tone carried the kind of authority that expected instant compliance, the voice of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Sarah looked up to find him standing beneath the Apache's nose, flanked by two other officers she didn't recognize. His face was set in the expression of someone who'd discovered exactly the kind of problem he'd been expecting to find. Sarah completed the systems check. She was running before responding, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She'd learned long ago that reacting hastily to authority figures usually made situations worse, whether the authority figure was an angry customer at the diner or a supervisor questioning her work methods. "Just finishing the inspection, Captain. Everything's properly documented." Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice dropping to the kind of quiet intensity that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Your job is to prepare these aircraft for retirement, not to play pilot with equipment you're not qualified to operate. I've been watching you, Mitchell. You spend more time in that cockpit than some of our actual pilots spend in theirs. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being misunderstood, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times during her civilian years when supervisors questioned her methods or motivations. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just trying to keep a job. She was trying to preserve something valuable that others seemed determined to throw away. "I'm ensuring proper documentation of all systems and capabilities," Sarah replied carefully. "The retirement paperwork requires verification that all equipment is accounted for and properly maintained. That means understanding what we're actually retiring." One of the officers flanking Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Sarah recognized him as Major Wilson from Flight Operations, someone who'd actually flown Apaches in combat and might understand the difference between proper maintenance procedures and unauthorized activity. But Wilson remained silent, apparently content to let Rodriguez lead the confrontation. Rodriguez stepped even closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the coffee on his breath and see the slight tremor in his hands that suggested too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Let me be very clear, Sergeant. Your background is maintenance, not aviation. Your job is inventory and documentation, not flight training. I don't care how many years you spent fixing coffee machines or gas pumps. That doesn't qualify you to operate military aircraft." The reference to her civilian background hit like a physical blow. Sarah had grown accustomed to subtle dismissals of her unconventional path to military service, but Rodriguez's words carried a deliberate cruelty that went beyond professional criticism. He wasn't just questioning her competence. He was attacking her worth as a person, suggesting that her years of civilian work had somehow disqualified her from military achievement. Sarah climbed down from the cockpit with the same careful precision she brought to everything else, her movements controlled despite the anger building in her chest. She'd faced this kind of class-based dismissal before, the assumption that certain types of work marked you as inherently less capable than people with different opportunities or backgrounds. The difference was that in her civilian jobs she'd been able to prove her worth through performance. Here, she was being judged before being given the chance to demonstrate what she could do. "Captain Rodriguez," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of respectful firmness she'd perfected during years of dealing with difficult situations, "I understand your concerns about proper procedures. But dismissing someone's capabilities based on their background rather than their demonstrated performance isn't good leadership. It's just prejudice." The words were out before Sarah could reconsider them, and she immediately saw Rodriguez's face flush with anger. Challenging a superior officer's judgment was risky under the best circumstances. Suggesting that his judgment was influenced by prejudice was the kind of insubordination that could end military careers. But Sarah had spent too many years watching competent people dismissed for irrelevant reasons to stay silent when it was happening to her. Rodriguez's response was swift and predictable. "Sergeant Mitchell, you're relieved of aircraft access effective immediately. Report to administrative duties until further notice. And I suggest you remember that questioning your superior's judgment is not among your authorized responsibilities." Sarah nodded once, gathered her tools and documentation, and walked away. Without another word. She'd said what needed to be said, and arguing further would only make the situation worse. But as she walked across the tarmac toward the administrative building, she could feel the eyes of other personnel watching her departure. Some looked sympathetic, recognizing the unfairness of what they'd witnessed. Others seemed satisfied, as if Rodriguez's actions confirmed their own assumptions about civilian recruits who didn't know their place. The administrative duties Sarah was assigned felt deliberately meaningless, the kind of busy work designed to occupy time rather than accomplish anything important. She spent her days updating inventory databases, filing maintenance reports, and processing paperwork for equipment transfers. It was work that required attention to detail, but offered no opportunity for growth or meaningful contribution. Worse, it kept her away from the aircraft she'd been assigned to evaluate, preventing her from completing the documentation work that had originally justified her presence on the flight line. But administrative isolation also provided unexpected advantages. Sarah's new workspace was in the Base Operations Center, where she had access to flight schedules, mission reports, and operational planning documents that most maintenance personnel never saw. She learned about current deployment patterns, training requirements, and the ongoing transition from manned to unmanned systems that was reshaping military aviation. More importantly, she began to understand the gaps that the transition was creating, the capabilities that were being lost as older aircraft and experienced personnel were phased out. The picture that emerged from studying these documents was more complex than the simple modernization narrative that justified retiring aircraft like Desert Storm. Yes, newer systems offered certain advantages in terms of efficiency and reduced personnel requirements. But they also created vulnerabilities, particularly in environments where communication links could be disrupted or where autonomous systems might struggle with unexpected conditions. The military was becoming more capable in some ways while simultaneously becoming more fragile in others. Sarah's understanding of these vulnerabilities deepened during her third week of administrative duty, when she was assigned to process after-action reports from recent training exercises. The reports painted a troubling picture of over-reliance on systems that worked perfectly under ideal conditions, but failed catastrophically when those conditions changed. Drone operations required constant communication links that could be jammed or interrupted. Automated systems struggled with terrain that didn't match their programming parameters. And when technology failed, there were fewer and fewer people with the skills to provide backup capabilities. One report particularly caught Sarah's attention. It described a training scenario where a simulated communications blackout had left a forward operating base without air support for over 6 hours. Modern aircraft couldn't operate without data links and GPS navigation. Drone operators couldn't function without real-time communication with their platforms. The exercise had been terminated early when it became clear that the participating units had no viable backup plan for operating in a communications-denied environment. Sarah read the report 3 times, thinking about Desert Storm sitting idle in its hangar while newer, more sophisticated aircraft proved helpless in conditions that older helicopters had been designed to handle. The Apache didn't need constant communication links to operate effectively. Its systems were designed for autonomous operation, with pilots trained to navigate and engage targets using onboard sensors and manual techniques. In the kind of contested environment where modern systems failed, older aircraft like Desert Storm might actually be more capable than their replacements. But pointing out these concerns would require Sarah to admit she'd been studying operational documents outside her assigned responsibilities. It would mean risking another confrontation with Rodriguez and potentially facing more serious disciplinary action. So she kept her observations to herself and continued processing paperwork while thinking about problems that no one seemed interested in solving. The isolation might have continued indefinitely, except for the arrival of Lieutenant Emma Davis. Davis was fresh from flight school, 23 years old, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from excelling in structured training environments. She'd graduated at the top of her class, earned high marks in both academic and practical evaluations, and been assigned to Fort Carson as part of the new generation of pilots who would operate advanced systems and unmanned platforms. Davis's first encounter with Sarah came during a routine visit to the operations center to review flight schedules. She noticed Sarah working at a computer terminal and approached with the friendly curiosity of someone encountering an unfamiliar face in a small community. "I don't think we've met," Davis said, extending her hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "Emma Davis, just assigned to flight operations. Are you new here too?" Sarah looked up from her paperwork and shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of Davis's grip and the way she made direct eye contact. These were leadership techniques taught in officer training, but they seemed natural, rather than practiced. Sarah Mitchell, Maintenance and Logistics. I've been here about 2 years. Davis's expression shifted slightly as she processed this information. 2 years was long enough to establish a reputation, and if she'd never heard of Sarah, it probably meant Sarah wasn't considered important enough to mention. What kind of aircraft do you work on? I'm transitioning to Apache operations, so probably be seeing a lot of the maintenance crew. Actually, I've been working primarily with aircraft retirement procedures, Sarah replied carefully, documenting capabilities and preparing older systems for decommissioning, including some of the Apaches you'll be replacing. The change in Davis's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile became more polite and less genuine, the kind of expression reserved for people who weren't quite peers. Oh, that's interesting. I suppose someone has to handle the administrative side of modernization. Though I have to say, from what I've heard about the older systems, we're probably better off moving to more advanced platforms. Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time it came with an additional layer of frustration. Davis was criticizing systems she'd never operated, dismissing capabilities she'd never tested, based on assumptions rather than experience. It was the kind of uninformed confidence that Sarah had encountered throughout her civilian career, the certainty of people who confused credentials with competence. Have you had a chance to fly any of the older Apaches? Sarah asked, keeping her tone neutral and professional. I'd be curious to hear your comparison based on actual experience. Davis laughed, a sound that carried just enough condescension to be insulting without being overtly rude. Well, no, not yet. But the training materials make it pretty clear that the older systems are limited compared to what we're getting now. Better avionics, improved sensors, more efficient operations. It's really a question of whether we want to be stuck in the past or embrace the future. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Davis explaining the advantages of modern systems and Sarah listening politely while fighting the urge to mention specific scenarios where those advantages might become liabilities. When Davis finally left to attend a briefing, Sarah returned to her paperwork with a new understanding of the cultural divide that separated her from the mainstream military community. Davis represented everything that Sarah was not: young, credentialed, confident in ways that came from following expected paths to predicted outcomes. She'd never worked a civilian job where failure meant missing rent payments. She'd never had to prove herself in environments where competence was measured by results rather than test scores. And she'd certainly never had to overcome assumptions about her worth based on factors beyond her control. But Davis had also revealed something important about the institution Sarah was trying to serve. The military's embrace of modernization wasn't just about improving capabilities. It was about cultural identity, about seeing itself as sophisticated and technologically advanced rather than traditional and experience-based. Defending older systems wasn't just questioning specific pieces of equipment. It was challenging the military's vision of itself as a forward-looking organization. Understanding this dynamic helped Sarah make sense of her treatment by Rodriguez and others. Her advocacy for Desert Storm wasn't being seen as professional judgment about aircraft capabilities. It was being interpreted as resistance to institutional change, as someone clinging to outdated approaches instead of embracing progress. The fact that she might be right about the aircraft's continued value was less important than the symbolism of what she represented. This realization came with both clarity and frustration. Sarah now understood why her expertise was being dismissed, and why her unconventional background made her suspect rather than valuable. But understanding the problem didn't suggest any obvious solutions. She couldn't change her history or magically acquire the credentials that would make her opinions more acceptable. And she couldn't abandon her conviction that valuable capabilities were being discarded for reasons that had more to do with perception than performance. The frustration deepened during subsequent encounters with Davis and other young officers, who seemed to view Sarah's concerns as evidence of backward thinking rather than professional insight. They were polite but dismissive, willing to listen briefly before explaining why her perspective was limited by lack of exposure to modern systems. None of them had operated in environments where those modern systems might fail, but that didn't seem to affect their confidence in technological solutions. Sarah began to feel like a translator trying to communicate between two groups that spoke different languages. On one side were people who understood aircraft as mechanical systems that required intuitive operation and constant attention to detail. On the other side were people who saw aircraft as platforms for sophisticated technologies that would handle most operational challenges automatically. Both perspectives had merit, but neither group seemed capable of understanding the other's point of view. The cultural divide became personal during an incident in the base cafeteria called the Eagle's Nest. Sarah was eating lunch alone, reviewing maintenance manuals during her break, when she overheard a conversation at a nearby table. Davis was talking with several other young officers, their voices carrying the casual authority of people who assumed their opinions were worth sharing. "I still can't believe they're keeping some of those ancient birds around as long as they are," Davis was saying as she picked at her salad. "I mean, I understand that change is hard for people who've been working with obsolete systems for years, but at some point you have to be realistic about capabilities." Another officer, someone Sarah recognized from flight operations but couldn't name, nodded in agreement. "The problem is that some of the older personnel get emotionally attached to equipment, instead of thinking objectively about performance. They take it personally when their favorite aircraft gets retired, like it's somehow a reflection on them." Davis continued the thought. "Exactly. And then they try to justify keeping outdated systems by inventing scenarios where newer equipment supposedly can't perform. It's like they don't understand that technology actually improves over time." Sarah continued reading her manual, but she could feel heat rising in her cheeks as the conversation continued. The officers weren't mentioning her by name, but the references were clearly directed at her situation and others like it. They were discussing her professional judgment as if it were a psychological problem, her expertise as if it were emotional dysfunction. "I heard there's one maintenance sergeant who's been spending unauthorized time in one of the old Apaches," said a third voice, this one belonging to someone Sarah couldn't see without turning around. "Acting like she's qualified to evaluate flight systems when her background is basically fast food and retail." The laughter that followed was quiet but unmistakable, the kind of amused dismissal that Sarah had heard throughout her civilian career whenever educated people discovered her employment history. But this time the laughter hurt more, because it came from people she'd hoped might judge her differently, people who were supposed to value competence over credentials. Sarah finished her lunch without responding to the conversation, gathered her materials, and left the cafeteria with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained during countless similar situations in her civilian life. But as she walked back toward the operations center, she found herself thinking about the aircraft sitting unused in their hangars, while people who'd never operated them made decisions about their value. She thought about capabilities being lost, while their replacements remained untested in realistic conditions. And she thought about the possibility that someday, when sophisticated systems failed and communication links went dark, someone might need exactly the kind of simple, reliable capability that people like Davis were so eager to discard. The thought didn't comfort her, because it suggested that the cost of institutional arrogance might eventually be measured in ways that made hurt feelings seem trivial by comparison. But it did strengthen her resolve to maintain her unofficial preparation, to continue learning everything she could about systems that others considered obsolete. Because if that day ever came, If circumstances ever demanded the kind of basic competence that couldn't be programmed or automated, Sarah intended to be ready to provide it. Her father had taught her that machines were honest in ways that people often weren't. They responded to competent operation regardless of the operator's background or credentials. They performed reliably when maintained properly regardless of whether their capabilities were fashionable or appreciated. And they revealed their true value when conditions became difficult enough to separate performance from perception. Sarah couldn't control how others viewed her or her judgment, but she could control her own preparation. And preparation, she'd learned over 18 years of civilian struggle, was the only insurance available to people who couldn't rely on others to recognize their worth. The morning briefing in Colonel Patricia Hayes's office felt like a tribunal. Sarah sat rigidly in a government-issued chair that seemed designed to discourage comfort, facing a mahogany desk that gleamed under fluorescent lights harsh enough to reveal every wrinkle in her uniform. Captain Rodriguez stood to her left, his posture radiating the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully built a case against a problem subordinate. Major Wilson flanked her right, his expression carefully neutral in the way that experienced officers perfected when witnessing career-ending conversations. Colonel Hayes was a compact woman in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail they encountered. She'd commanded aviation units in 3 different theaters, earned decorations for leadership under fire, and built a reputation for making hard decisions without hesitation. Sarah had never spoken with her directly, but her presence commanded the kind of respect that came from demonstrated competence rather than assigned authority. Hayes opened a manila folder and reviewed its contents for a full minute before speaking, her silence filling the room like pressure before a storm. When she finally looked up, her gaze settled on Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Sergeant Mitchell," Hayes began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who expected to be heard. "Clearly the first time, I've reviewed Captain Rodriguez's report regarding your conduct over the past several weeks. The allegations are serious, and the pattern of behavior is concerning." Sarah remained silent, understanding that responding before being asked would only confirm assumptions about her inability to follow proper procedures. She'd learned during her civilian years that defending yourself too early often made situations worse, and military culture seemed to operate by similar rules about knowing when to speak and when to listen. Hayes continued reading from the folder. "Unauthorized access to aircraft systems. Exceeding the scope of assigned duties. Questioning superior judgment in front of other personnel. And most recently, studying classified operational documents outside your clearance level." She closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "These aren't minor infractions, Sergeant. They represent a fundamental misunderstanding of military discipline and appropriate boundaries." The accusations hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being comprehensively mischaracterized, but she also recognized the careful construction of Rodriguez's case. Each allegation contained enough truth to be defensible while omitting context that might complicate the narrative. Yes, she'd spent time in aircraft cockpits, but as part of documenting systems for retirement. Yes, she'd questioned Rodriguez's judgment, but in response to what she considered unprofessional behavior. And yes, she'd reviewed operational documents, but only those that came across her desk during assigned administrative duties. "Colonel," Sarah said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that everything she said would be scrutinized for evidence of insubordination. "I respectfully request the opportunity to provide context for these allegations." Hayes raised an eyebrow, a gesture that somehow conveyed both curiosity and warning. "You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't recommend immediate transfer to a position where your particular interpretation of duty won't create further problems." Sarah took a breath and organized her thoughts, understanding that this might be her only chance to present her perspective before decisions were made that could end her military career. Colonel, my background includes 18 years of civilian work where performance was measured by results rather than credentials. I approach military duties with the same focus on outcomes and attention to detail that made me successful in that environment. She paused, noting that Hayes was listening without interruption while Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably beside her. When I was assigned to oversee aircraft retirement procedures, I took that responsibility seriously. That meant understanding what capabilities we were retiring, not just processing paperwork. The time I spent in aircraft cockpits was necessary to properly document systems and verify that all equipment was accounted for. Sarah could see Rodriguez preparing to interrupt, but Hayes silenced him with a slight gesture. "Continue, Sergeant." The documents I reviewed were all materials that came through my administrative workstation as part of assigned duties. But studying them revealed concerning patterns about over-reliance on systems that might not be available in contested environments. When I attempted to raise these concerns through proper channels, I was told that my background disqualified me from having relevant opinions about operational matters. Sarah's voice remained level, despite the emotion building behind her words. "Colonel, I understand military hierarchy and the importance of following orders. But I also understand that good military leadership means listening to input from personnel with relevant expertise, regardless of how they acquired that expertise. Dismissing observations based on the observer's background rather than the validity of their content isn't good leadership. It's institutional prejudice." The room fell silent except for the humming of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up on the flight line. Rodriguez's face had reddened during Sarah's explanation, while Wilson maintained his carefully neutral expression. Hayes studied Sarah for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Sergeant Mitchell," Hayes said finally, "your concerns about institutional prejudice might have merit in some circumstances. But this institution operates on the principle that authority flows from rank and qualification, not from personal opinion about the value of one's own observations." She leaned forward slightly. "When you question a superior officer's judgment, you're not challenging institutional prejudice. You're undermining military discipline." Sarah felt something deflate inside her chest, the familiar sensation of watching a reasonable argument be dismissed by people who'd already decided what they wanted to hear. It was the same feeling she'd experienced countless times in her civilian life when supervisors chose to focus on procedure rather than performance. When managers valued compliance over competence. Hayes wasn't finished. "Furthermore, your assumption that 18 years of civilian employment provides relevant insight into military aviation operations suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service requires. Civilian work experience, no matter how extensive, doesn't substitute for proper training and established qualifications." The words struck Sarah like physical blows, each sentence reinforcing the message that her background was not just irrelevant, but actively disqualifying. She'd heard similar dismissals throughout her civilian career, but they'd always come from people whose own competence she could question. Hayes was different. She was clearly competent, experienced, and successful. By any reasonable measure, her dismissal of Sarah's perspective carried weight that couldn't be easily discounted. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, making one final attempt to bridge the gap between her perspective and institutional expectations, "I'm not suggesting that civilian experience substitutes for military training. I'm suggesting that it might complement it in ways that could be valuable if anyone willing to consider the possibility." Hayes closed the folder and stood up, signaling that the conversation was reaching its conclusion. "Sergeant Mitchell, effective immediately you're reassigned to supply operations. Your duties will be strictly administrative and will not involve any contact with aircraft or operational planning documents. Captain Rodriguez will handle the remainder of the aircraft retirement process." Sarah nodded once, understanding that arguing further would only make her situation worse. She'd made her case as clearly as possible and been comprehensively rejected. The meeting was over, and her role in anything related to aviation was finished, but Hayes wasn't quite done. "I want to be clear about something, Sergeant. Your technical competence isn't in question. Your work has been thorough, and your attention to detail is commendable. But military effectiveness requires more than technical competence. It requires understanding your role within a larger organization and respecting the boundaries that make that organization function." Sarah stood and prepared to leave, but Hayes continued speaking. "I'm not transferring you because I think you're incompetent. I'm transferring you because I think you're unable to accept that competence alone doesn't qualify you to make decisions outside your area of responsibility. That's a perspective that could be dangerous in operational environments, where clear chains of command can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." The dismissal was complete and professionally delivered, leaving no room for appeal or reconsideration. Sarah saluted properly, turned, and walked out of the office with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout her civilian career when facing similar rejections. But as she walked across the base toward the supply operations building, she found herself thinking about Hayes's final comment about chain of command and catastrophic failure. The irony wasn't lost on her that institutional insistence on proper channels and established qualifications might itself become a source of catastrophic failure if circumstances ever demanded capabilities that fell outside normal procedures. But pointing out that irony would require exactly the kind of thinking outside assigned boundaries that had gotten her in trouble in the first place. Supply operations turned out to be everything Sarah had expected. Endless inventories of spare parts, equipment requisitions that required multiple approvals, and databases that needed constant updating to track materials flowing in and out of the base. It was work that required attention to detail, but offered no opportunity for initiative or meaningful contribution to anything she considered important. The personnel in supply operations were pleasant enough, but they seemed to operate in a different world from the flight line. Their concerns centered on paperwork accuracy, delivery schedules, and maintaining proper documentation for audit purposes. They were competent at their jobs and took pride in keeping complex logistic systems functioning smoothly, but they showed little interest in how their work connected to larger operational objectives. Sarah adapted to the new environment with the same professionalism she'd brought to every job she'd ever held, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her knowledge and capabilities were being systematically wasted. She understood aircraft systems well enough to troubleshoot complex problems, but she was now responsible for ordering replacement parts for equipment she wasn't allowed to work on. She developed insights about operational vulnerabilities that might affect mission planning, but she was now isolated from any information that might allow her to contribute to solutions. The waste wasn't just personal. Sarah could see that. The base was losing institutional knowledge as experienced personnel were transferred or retired without adequate replacement. Younger soldiers understood newer systems but lacked the intuitive understanding that came from working with equipment under diverse conditions. Technology was advancing faster than training could adapt, creating gaps in capability that no one seemed to recognize or address. But Sarah's new position did provide one unexpected advantage: access to supply requests and maintenance, reports that revealed patterns invisible from any single perspective. As she processed requisitions for parts and materials, she began to see which systems were requiring more support than anticipated, and which new technologies were proving less reliable than their specifications suggested. The pattern that emerged over several weeks was troubling. Newer aircraft were requiring more frequent maintenance than older systems, often for problems that shouldn't have occurred with properly tested equipment. Communication systems were failing at rates that suggested fundamental design flaws rather than random mechanical problems. And most concerning, replacement parts for critical systems were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain as manufacturers focused on newer products. Rather than supporting existing equipment, Sarah compiled this information carefully, creating her own databases that tracked trends and identified potential problems before they became critical. It was work that no one had assigned her, but it felt important in ways that her official duties didn't. She was creating exactly the kind of comprehensive analysis that someone in operational planning should have been conducting, but apparently wasn't. The opportunity to share this information came during a routine inventory meeting where department heads gathered to discuss supply requirements and budget projections. Sarah attended as a recording secretary responsible for taking notes, but not expected to contribute to discussions. But as she listened to various officers describe equipment problems and supply chain challenges, she realized that each was describing pieces of a larger pattern that none of them could see from their individual perspectives. Major Wilson was complaining about communication failures during recent training exercises. Lieutenant Davis was requesting expedited delivery of replacement components for drone systems that had proven less durable than expected. Captain Rodriguez was noting increased maintenance requirements for newer aircraft that were supposed to require less support than the systems they'd replaced. Sarah listened to the discussion for nearly an hour before raising her hand to speak. The gesture was so unexpected that the room fell silent, with multiple officers turning to stare at the supply clerk who apparently thought she had something to contribute to operational planning. "Ma'am," Sarah addressed the senior officer chairing the meeting, "I may have information relevant to the issues being discussed." She paused, waiting for permission to continue while feeling the weight of skeptical attention from around the room. The senior officer nodded slowly. "Proceed, Sergeant." Sarah opened the folder she'd brought to the meeting and referenced the analysis she'd been developing during her supply duties. Based on requisition patterns and maintenance reports over the past 6 weeks, it appears that several of the problems being discussed individually are actually components of a systematic reliability issue affecting multiple new systems. She could see Rodriguez preparing to interrupt, but the senior officer gestured for him to remain silent. For example, the communication failures Major Wilson mentioned correspond to increased requests for replacement modules that are manufactured by the same contractor responsible for drone components that Lieutenant Davis is having problems with. And the maintenance issues Captain Rodriguez described seem to correlate with premature wear in systems that share common design elements with the communication equipment. Sarah's presentation was brief and factual, focusing on data rather than interpretation. But the implications were clear to anyone willing to consider them. The base wasn't experiencing random equipment problems. It was experiencing systematic failures in technologies that had been adopted without adequate testing or preparation for real-world conditions. The room remained silent for several seconds after Sarah finished speaking. Officers exchanged glances. That suggested they were processing information they hadn't previously connected. Finally, the senior officer spoke. "Sergeant Mitchell, this analysis you've conducted, was this part of your assigned duties in supply operations?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with having exceeded boundaries she hadn't realized existed. "No, ma'am. I compiled this information during personal time because I noticed patterns that seemed important but weren't being addressed through normal channels." Another silence fell over the room, this one carrying a different quality than the first. Sarah could sense that she'd once again crossed invisible lines by taking initiative outside her assigned role. But she could also sense that the information she'd provided was valuable enough to complicate any simple response to her unauthorized analysis. Major Wilson spoke first. "Sergeant, the pattern you've identified, do you have recommendations for addressing these reliability issues?" The question was dangerous because it invited Sarah to step even further outside her assigned role. But it also represented exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been hoping for, a chance to contribute meaningfully to problem solving rather than just processing paperwork. "Sir," Sarah replied carefully, "addressing systematic reliability issues usually requires either improved maintenance protocols for existing equipment or consideration of alternative systems that have proven more reliable under similar conditions." Wilson pressed further. "And in your assessment, what alternative systems might be worth considering?" Sarah took a breath, understanding that her answer would determine whether this conversation led to meaningful change or another disciplinary meeting. "Some of the older aircraft scheduled for retirement have demonstrated better reliability under adverse conditions than the systems replacing them. It might be worth evaluating whether retiring those capabilities entirely is strategically wise, given current performance data." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Sarah had just recommended reconsidering aircraft retirement decisions that had already been finalized, using analysis that no one had authorized her to conduct. She'd also implicitly criticized the judgment of officers who'd supported those retirement decisions based on assumptions about technological superiority. Captain Rodriguez's response was predictable and immediate. "Sergeant Mitchell, you're completely overstepping your authority and expertise. Equipment retirement decisions are made at levels far above your clearance based on factors you're not qualified to evaluate." But Major Wilson held up a hand to stop Rodriguez's objection. "Captain, the sergeant has identified a pattern of systematic failures that none of us had recognized. Whether or not her recommendations are appropriate, her analysis deserves consideration, rather than automatic dismissal." Sarah felt a spark of hope that someone might finally be willing to evaluate her observations based on their merit rather than her credentials. But she also understood that Wilson's support might create additional problems for her if Rodriguez interpreted it as undermining his authority. The senior officer studied Sarah for a long moment before speaking. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report documenting the patterns you've identified and your methodology for tracking them. Include all supporting data, but avoid making specific policy recommendations. Let the analysis speak for itself." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was being given an opportunity to present her case formally while being warned not to exceed appropriate boundaries in doing so. It was more chance than she'd expected, but less authority than the situation seemed to require. As the meeting concluded and officers filed out of the room, Sarah remained behind to organize her notes and consider what she'd accomplished. She'd managed to get institutional attention for problems that were being ignored, but she'd also reinforced her reputation as someone who couldn't stay within assigned boundaries. Whether the attention would lead to meaningful change or additional disciplinary action remained to be seen. What seemed certain was that her informal analysis had revealed vulnerabilities in systems that everyone else considered improvements over older technologies. The question was whether institutional pride would allow acknowledgement of those vulnerabilities, or whether the messenger would be blamed for delivering unwelcome information about problems that were easier to ignore than address. The emergency alert pierced through Fort Carson's morning routine like a scream cutting through silence. Sarah was inventorying hydraulic fluid shipments in Supply Building C when the base-wide announcement crackled through speakers, mounted high on concrete walls, the voice of the duty officer tight, with controlled urgency that immediately commanded attention from everyone within hearing distance. "All personnel, this is not a drill. We have confirmed loss of contact with Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Kandahar Valley. Last communication indicated the base was under coordinated attack with heavy casualties. All available aircraft are to prepare for immediate deployment to provide air support and medical evacuation. This is Priority Alpha. All departments report readiness status immediately." Sarah's hands froze on the clipboard she'd been using to track inventory numbers, her mind immediately shifting from routine logistics to crisis response. Forward Operating Base Phoenix was a remote outpost positioned in some of the most challenging terrain in Afghanistan, a strategic location that provided early warning about insurgent movement but remained vulnerable due to its isolation from major support infrastructure. The base housed approximately 40 personnel, mostly intelligence specialists and communications technicians, whose work was critical, but whose defensive capabilities were limited. Around her, the supply depot erupted into controlled chaos as personnel scrambled to respond to requests for emergency equipment and materials. But Sarah found herself thinking about information she'd processed weeks earlier during her administrative duties. Intelligence reports that had described increased insurgent activity in the Kandahar Valley region and growing concerns about coordinated attacks on isolated outposts. The emergency briefing 20 minutes later confirmed Sarah's worst fears while revealing additional complications that transformed a serious situation into a potential catastrophe. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the packed briefing room, her expression grim as she outlined what they knew about the crisis unfolding 3,000 miles away. At approximately 0630 local time, Forward Operating Base Phoenix came under coordinated assault from what appears to be a substantial insurgent force. The attack began with mortar fire that knocked out their primary communication array, followed by small arms fire from multiple positions surrounding the base perimeter. Hayes paused to reference notes handed to her by an aide. Their last transmission indicated at least 12 casualties, requiring immediate medical evacuation, and requested air support to suppress enemy positions that had them effectively pinned down. The room remained silent except for the scratching of pens as officers took notes and the distant sound of aircraft engines spinning up on the flight line. Sarah listened carefully, her mind automatically processing tactical information and thinking about response capabilities even though she had no official role in mission planning. Hayes continued with information that made the situation exponentially more complex. Current weather conditions in the target area include severe thunderstorms with cloud ceilings below 1,000 feet and visibility less than half a mile. Additionally, intelligence indicates that insurgent forces may have acquired portable surface-to-air missiles, making low-altitude flight operations extremely hazardous. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning system, struggling to cool the crowded briefing room. The weather conditions Hayes described would severely limit the effectiveness of most modern aircraft, which relied on sophisticated sensors and communication links that function poorly in severe weather. More importantly, the threat of surface-to-air missiles would force aircraft to operate at altitudes where precision engagement became nearly impossible. Our primary response will consist of 2 F-16 fighters equipped with precision-guided munitions and advanced targeting systems, Hayes announced, indicating aircraft positions on a tactical display. Additionally, we'll deploy 3 Predator drones to provide continuous surveillance and additional strike capability once weather conditions improve. Sarah's heart sank as she processed this information. F-16 fighters were impressive aircraft, but they were designed for high-altitude operations where their speed and sophisticated systems provided maximum advantage. In the kind of low-altitude, close support mission that Forward Operating Base Phoenix required, fighters would struggle to distinguish between friendly and enemy forces while dealing with weather that degraded their primary sensors, the Predator. Drones were even more problematic. They required constant communication links with operators located thousands of miles away, links that were notoriously unreliable in severe weather. More critically, they lacked the armored protection and redundant systems necessary to operate effectively in contested airspace where surface-to-air missiles might be present. Major Wilson stood up to provide additional details about the planned response, but his information only reinforced Sarah's growing conviction that the mission was being planned around available resources rather than actual requirements. The F-16s will establish a combat air patrol over the target area and engage enemy positions using GPS-guided bombs delivered from medium altitude. The Predators will provide real-time intelligence and coordinate with ground forces to identify high-value targets. The plan sounded professional and technologically sophisticated, but Sarah could see fundamental problems that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. GPS guidance systems would be degraded by the same weather conditions that limited visibility. Medium-altitude bombing would be ineffective against enemy forces positioned close to friendly personnel. And real-time intelligence would be impossible to maintain if communication links were disrupted by weather or enemy action. Sarah raised her hand, an action that drew surprised stares from officers who hadn't expected input from supply personnel. During an operational briefing, Colonel Hayes noticed the gesture and nodded for her to speak, her expression suggesting curiosity about what a logistics sergeant might contribute to tactical planning. "Colonel," Sarah said carefully, understanding that she was stepping into dangerous territory, but believing that the lives at stake justified the risk. The weather conditions and terrain around Forward Operating Base Phoenix might limit the effectiveness of high-altitude operations and systems that rely on constant communication links. Hayes's expression shifted slightly, indicating that she was listening, but also that Sarah needed to make her point quickly and convincingly. "Continue, Sergeant." Sarah took a breath and organized her thoughts, knowing that she had perhaps 30 seconds to present information that might save lives or get her removed from the briefing room. "Ma'am, the Kandahar Valley terrain includes steep mountain ridges that create wind patterns and weather effects that can severely disrupt electronic systems. Aircraft operating at medium or high altitude might not be able to distinguish between friendly and enemy positions, especially in low visibility conditions." She paused, noting that several officers were now paying close attention, while others looked skeptical about receiving tactical advice from someone in supply operations. Additionally, if insurgent forces do have portable surface-to-air missiles, they'll likely position them to target aircraft following predictable flight patterns at expected altitudes. Captain Rodriguez stood up before Sarah could continue, his voice carrying the authority of someone reasserting proper boundaries after an inappropriate interruption. "Colonel, Sergeant Mitchell is clearly speaking outside her area of expertise. Tactical planning should be left to qualified personnel with appropriate training and clearance levels." But Major Wilson interrupted Rodriguez before he could continue his objection. "Actually, Captain, the sergeant's observations align with intelligence reports about terrain effects in that region. The question is whether we have alternative assets that might be better suited to the conditions she's describing." Sarah felt a moment of hope that someone might be willing to consider practical alternatives to a plan that seemed designed more around institutional preferences than operational requirements. But she also understood that suggesting specific alternatives would require her to step even further outside acceptable boundaries. Hayes studied Sarah for a long moment before responding. "Sergeant Mitchell, based on your analysis of terrain and weather effects, what type of aircraft capabilities would be most appropriate for this mission?" The question was both an opportunity and a trap. Hayes was inviting Sarah to provide specific recommendations while potentially setting her up for criticism if those recommendations challenged established plans or exceeded her supposed expertise. But with lives at stake, Sarah decided that professional risk was less important than mission effectiveness. "Colonel," Sarah replied carefully, "the mission requirements seem to call for aircraft that can operate effectively at low altitude. In severe weather, maintain stable platforms for precision engagement, and continue operating even if communication links are disrupted." She paused, understanding that her next words would determine whether she was taken seriously or removed from the discussion entirely. The H-64 Apache helicopters scheduled for retirement have all of those capabilities. They're designed for low-altitude operations, equipped with sensors that function in adverse weather, and capable of autonomous operation without constant communication support. The silence that followed Sarah's statement felt heavier than the humid air conditioning couldn't quite move. She just recommended using aircraft that had been officially determined obsolete for a mission that everyone else was planning around. More modern systems. Worse, she'd done so as someone whose official role was inventory management rather than tactical planning. Rodriguez's response was immediate and predictable. "Colonel, this is exactly the kind of inappropriate input I was referring to. Sergeant Mitchell is recommending obsolete aircraft for a critical mission, based on her personal attachment to older systems, rather than objective analysis of capabilities. But Lieutenant Davis, who Sarah hadn't expected to support anything, she suggested, spoke up with information that surprised everyone in the room. Actually, Captain, some of the Apache systems might be relevant to current conditions. During my training, we studied historical examples of close air support in similar terrain, and helicopter platforms consistently outperformed fixed-wing aircraft in low visibility, close proximity scenarios. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Davis, who was supporting her recommendation despite their previous disagreements. But she could also see that the conversation was heading toward a decision point where institutional preferences would collide with operational requirements. Colonel Hayes ended the debate with characteristic decisiveness. "Major Wilson, what's the current status of our Apache aircraft? Are any of them mission capable for immediate deployment?" Wilson consulted notes provided by maintenance personnel before responding. "Ma'am, we have 3 Apache helicopters on base. 2 are scheduled for retirement and haven't been maintained to operational standards. The third is Army 0-7-0-5-4-3-8, which has been maintained by—" He paused and looked directly at Sarah. "By Sergeant Mitchell as part of the retirement documentation process." Sarah's heart began beating faster as she realized that her unofficial maintenance of Desert Storm might suddenly become relevant to a real operational requirement. For weeks, she'd been preparing the aircraft for retirement while secretly hoping that someone might recognize its continued value. Now circumstances had created exactly the kind of emergency where that value might be desperately needed. Hayes turned her attention back to Sarah with an intensity that suggested the next few minutes would determine multiple careers as well as the mission plan. "Sergeant Mitchell, in your assessment, is aircraft 0705438 capable of immediate deployment for the mission we've described?" Sarah felt the weight of the question like physical pressure. Everything she'd learned during her years of civilian work, everything she'd observed during her time maintaining Desert Storm, and everything she'd studied about helicopter operations in contested environments had prepared her for this moment. But answering honestly would require her to admit that she'd been maintaining an aircraft beyond official requirements and that she believed herself qualified to assess its operational capabilities. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, "Desert Storm is fully mission capable. All systems are operational, all weapons are functional, and all maintenance is current. She's ready to fly immediately." Hayes studied Sarah for another long moment before asking the question that would change everything. "And in your professional assessment, Sergeant, are you qualified to pilot that aircraft in the mission we described?" The room fell completely silent except for the humming of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Sarah understood that Hayes was asking whether someone with her background and training could successfully complete a mission that experienced pilots were reluctant to attempt using more sophisticated aircraft. Sarah thought about her father working on helicopters in their garage, teaching her that machines responded to understanding rather than credentials. She thought about 18 years of civilian work that had taught her to solve problems with whatever resources were available rather than whatever resources were preferred. And she thought about forward operating Base Phoenix, where 40 people were fighting for their lives while waiting for help that might not come if institutional Preferences took precedence over practical capabilities. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said simply. "I am." The chaos that followed Sarah's declaration lasted approximately 90 seconds, during which multiple officers spoke simultaneously while Hayes maintained silence that somehow commanded more attention than any of the competing voices. Rodriguez was demanding that Sarah be removed from the briefing for exceeding every possible boundary of appropriate conduct. Wilson was asking technical questions about aircraft capabilities and weather limitations. Davis was providing additional historical examples of helicopter effectiveness in similar conditions. And various other officers were debating qualification, standards, mission requirements, and the wisdom of deploying obsolete aircraft when modern alternatives were available. Hayes ended the debate by standing up and walking to the tactical display, where she studied terrain maps and weather data for several minutes while the room gradually returned to silence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone making a decision that would define her leadership legacy. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have 40 people fighting for their lives in conditions that our standard response capabilities may not be adequate to address. Sergeant Mitchell has identified potential alternatives that deserve consideration regardless of how unconventional they might be." She turned to face Sarah directly. "Sergeant, you have 15 minutes to demonstrate that your aircraft is mission ready and that you're qualified to operate it under combat conditions. If you can do that, you'll have authorization to deploy immediately." Sarah nodded once, understanding that she was being given exactly the opportunity she'd been preparing for during months of unofficial training and maintenance. But she also understood that failure would end her military career, while success might save lives that would otherwise be lost to institutional rigidity. As she walked toward the hangar where Desert Storm waited under dusty tarps and retirement tags, Sarah felt the kind of calm focus that had carried her through 18 years of civilian challenges and 2 years of military service. She'd spent her entire adult life preparing for moments when competence mattered more than credentials, when results mattered more than procedures, and when someone had to step forward because waiting for perfect conditions meant accepting unacceptable outcomes. Desert Storm was exactly where Sarah had left her, covered in tarps that concealed an aircraft, maintained to standards that exceeded official requirements. Sarah pulled away the coverings with steady hands, revealing the helicopter that had become both her obsession and her preparation for exactly this kind of moment. Every system had been checked and rechecked. Every component had been maintained beyond regulation standards. Every detail had been prepared for the possibility that someday, someone might need what others considered obsolete. The pre-flight inspection took 8 minutes, during which Sarah verified that every critical system was functioning properly while a small crowd of officers and technicians gathered to watch her work. Her movements were efficient and confident, reflecting both formal training and intuitive understanding developed through months of detailed maintenance work. When she climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence, Desert Storm responded like an aircraft that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. The engine spun up smoothly, generating the distinctive sound that had earned Apache helicopters their fearsome reputation. Systems came online in proper sequence, displaying green status indicators across instruments that Sarah knew intimately. Within minutes, she had a fully operational attack helicopter ready for immediate deployment to a combat zone, where lives depended on capabilities that everyone else had written off as obsolete. Colonel Hayes approached the aircraft as Sarah completed her systems checks, her expression indicating that she was witnessing something that challenged her assumptions about both personnel and equipment. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said over the sound of rotating blades, "you have authorization to deploy immediately. Radio call sign will be Guardian Angel. Your mission is to provide close air support and medical evacuation for forward operating Base Phoenix. Weather conditions are severe and enemy capability is unknown. Do you understand your orders?" Sarah looked down from the cockpit at the woman who was trusting her with a mission that could determine whether 40 people lived or died. "Yes, ma'am." Guardian Angel understands and accepts. Hayes stepped back as Sarah increased power and lifted. Desert Storm into the humid Colorado air. As the base fell away beneath her, Sarah could see other aircraft preparing for departure. The F-16 fighters that would provide high-altitude cover, and the support aircraft that would follow when she'd assessed conditions on the ground. But for now she was alone with an aircraft that everyone had considered worthless, heading toward a situation where conventional wisdom said she had no chance of success. The flight to Afghanistan took 14 hours, including refueling stops that gave Sarah time to study weather reports and intelligence updates about the situation at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. The news was consistently bad. Weather conditions were worsening rather than improving. Enemy forces appeared to be well-equipped and tactically sophisticated. And most critically, there had been no communication with the base for over 6 hours, suggesting that the situation might have deteriorated beyond the point where rescue was possible. But Sarah had spent 18 years learning that impossible. Situations sometimes yielded to patient effort and careful preparation. As Desert Storm crossed into Afghan airspace and began descending toward the Kandahar Valley, she found herself thinking not about the risks she was facing, but about the people she might be able to help if everything she'd learned during her civilian and military careers proved sufficient for the challenge ahead. The approach to Forward Operating Base Phoenix tested every skill Sarah had developed and several she'd never practiced under realistic conditions. Weather conditions were exactly as severe as intelligence reports had indicated, with cloud ceilings below 500 feet and visibility that fluctuated between marginal and non-existent. Rain fell in sheets that challenged the helicopter's sensors and created wind patterns that required constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. But Desert Storm responded to Sarah's handling like an aircraft that had been designed for exactly these conditions. Its systems remained functional despite weather that would have disabled more sophisticated platforms. Its flight characteristics remained predictable despite turbulence that would have challenged larger aircraft. And most importantly, its weapon systems remained accurate despite conditions that degraded the precision guidance systems that modern aircraft relied upon. Sarah's first view of Forward Operating Base Phoenix confirmed that the situation was as desperate as intelligence reports had suggested. The base was surrounded by enemy positions that had used the weather as cover to establish overlapping fields of fire around the perimeter. Mortar positions were clearly visible on ridgelines that provided commanding views of the facility. And the base itself showed clear evidence of damage from sustained attack, with several buildings showing impact craters and debris scattered across the central compound. More critically, Sarah could see personnel moving between defensive positions in ways that suggested they were still fighting but running critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. The base's helicopter landing pad was intact but surrounded by enemy positions that would make conventional approach impossible without suppressing multiple threat sources simultaneously. Sarah keyed her radio to establish contact with surviving personnel at the base, hoping that internal communication systems had survived, even though external links had been severed. Forward Operating Base Phoenix, this is Guardian Angel. I am an Apache helicopter in your immediate area and ready to provide fire support. Please respond if you can hear this transmission. The response came immediately, the voice tight with exhaustion and desperation, but unmistakably relieved. Guardian Angel, this is Phoenix Base Commander Major Thompson. We have been under sustained attack for 14 hours with 12 urgent medical evacuations required. Enemy positions surround our perimeter, and we have no effective way to engage targets on the ridgelines. Sarah studied the tactical situation while maintaining her position in cloud cover that concealed her from ground observation. The enemy had positioned themselves intelligently, using terrain features to create interlocking fields of fire while remaining protected from conventional air attack. Engaging them would require precise, low-altitude fire that could distinguish between enemy positions and friendly personnel, separated by distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. Phoenix Base, Guardian Angel copies your situation. I'm going to begin engaging enemy position, starting with mortar sites on the Luftwaffe Eastern Ridge. Keep your people under cover and be prepared to mark your perimeter with colored smoke when I request it. Sarah descended to an altitude that brought desert storm below the worst of the weather, but well within range of any surface-to-air missiles that enemy forces might possess. The helicopter shuddered as it encountered wind shear between mountain ridges, but its flight controls remained responsive and its weapon systems maintained target acquisition despite conditions that would have defeated less robust platforms. The first engagement lasted approximately 30 seconds and eliminated 3 mortar positions that had been systematically destroying forward operating base Phoenix's defensive capabilities. Sarah's approach was silent and invisible until the key moment she opened fire, using terrain features to mask her attack until she was close enough to ensure target destruction with minimal ammunition expenditure. The enemy's response was immediate and intense, with small arms fire and at least 1 surface-to-air missile launched in her direction. But Desert Storm's armor and evasive capabilities allowed her to complete the attack and withdraw before suffering significant damage. The pattern continued for the next 40 minutes as Sarah systematically eliminated enemy positions that threatened the base while avoiding the kind of extended exposure that would allow effective countermeasures. Each attack was planned and executed with the precision that came from understanding both her aircraft's capabilities and the tactical situation she was operating within. Desert Storm performed flawlessly despite conditions that would have grounded more sophisticated aircraft. Its simple but robust systems proving ideal for the kind of close support mission that had been its original design purpose. When the last enemy position had been neutralized, Sarah established communication with the base to coordinate medical evacuation for personnel who required immediate transport to advanced medical facilities. The landing was perhaps the most challenging part of the entire mission, requiring her to navigate between damaged buildings while maintaining stability in wind conditions that challenged the helicopter's control authority. But Desert Storm settled onto the landing pad like an aircraft returning home after a routine training flight, its engines maintaining steady power while medical personnel loaded casualties with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing lives depend on speed. The evacuation flight back to safe airspace took 20 minutes, during which Sarah monitored her passengers' condition while maintaining communication with medical personnel who guided her through procedures for stabilizing critical patients during transport. 3 of the casualties were stable enough to survive transport to advanced medical care. Without immediate evacuation, all 3 would have died before conventional rescue forces could have reached them through weather that grounded other aircraft. For another 6 hours, Sarah's return to Fort Carson 12 hours later felt surreal after the intensity of combat operations. Desert Storm touched down on the same tarmac where she'd been dismissed as obsolete equipment maintained by unqualified personnel. But now the helicopter bore visible evidence of successful combat operations, scorch marks from near-miss explosions, small caliber bullet holes that hadn't penetrated critical systems, and the kind of wear that came from being operated at the limits of its design envelope under conditions that had proven its worth beyond any theoretical evaluation. Colonel Hayes was waiting on the tarmac as Sarah shut down the engines and completed post-flight procedures. Around her, ground crews and officers gathered to examine an aircraft that had just completed a mission everyone had considered impossible, using capabilities that everyone had written off as obsolete. Sergeant Mitchell has said as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, "Preliminary reports indicate that you successfully eliminated multiple enemy positions evacuated 3 critical casualties, and accomplished mission objectives that our primary response assets were unable to achieve. She paused, studying Sarah with an expression that combined professional respect with personal reassessment. How do you explain the success of an obsolete aircraft and an unqualified pilot in conditions that defeated more advanced systems? Sarah looked at Desert Storm, its rotor blades still turning slowly as residual momentum dissipated, and thought about all the lessons that had prepared her for this moment. Colonel, the aircraft isn't obsolete. It's specialized for missions that more advanced systems aren't designed to handle. And I'm not unqualified. I'm just qualified differently than people who learn to fly in peacetime conditions using technologies that work perfectly until they don't work at all. Hayes nodded slowly, her expression indicating that she was processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about personnel, equipment, and the relationship between sophistication and effectiveness. Sergeant Mitchell, effective. Immediately you're reassigned to flight operations with authorization to maintain and operate Apache aircraft as mission requirements dictate. Your performance today suggests that our assessment of both your capabilities and your equipment was fundamentally flawed. She paused, looking around at the officers and personnel who had gathered to witness Sarah's return. Furthermore, I'm ordering a comprehensive review of aircraft retirement procedures to determine whether we've been discarding capabilities that remain strategically valuable. Your analysis of systematic reliability issues appears to have been more accurate than our official assessments. Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with finally being able to contribute meaningfully to something she considered important. She'd spent 18 years preparing for opportunities that never seemed to come, and 2 years of military service watching valuable capabilities being wasted through institutional short-sightedness. Today, preparation had met opportunity in circumstances that allowed competence to overcome credential-based prejudice. But the most satisfying part wasn't personal recognition. It was knowing that 3 people who would have died were now alive. Because someone had been willing to look beyond surface appearances to recognize value that others couldn't see. That was a lesson Sarah had learned during her civilian years and had finally been able to apply in circumstances where the stakes justified the risks required to challenge institutional assumptions. 6 months later, Sarah was promoted to warrant officer and assigned as lead instructor for Apache operations at Fort Carson. Her students included both experienced pilots transitioning from other aircraft and new pilots, learning helicopter operations for the first time. But all of them learned the same fundamental lesson that had guided Sarah's approach to both civilian and military challenges. Competence matters more than credentials. Preparation creates opportunities that can't be anticipated, and sometimes the most valuable capabilities are found in places where institutional wisdom says they shouldn't exist. Desert Storm was officially returned to active service and became the primary training aircraft for advanced combat operations. Its success in conditions that defeated more sophisticated systems had prompted a broader reevaluation of aircraft retirement policies and reliability standards that revealed systematic problems with newer technologies that had been adopted without adequate testing. Sarah's civilian background, once considered a disqualifying factor, became a model for recruiting personnel with non-traditional experience who brought perspectives that complemented conventional military training. Her analysis of supply chain patterns and equipment reliability became standard procedure for identifying potential problems before they became mission-critical failures. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's story became an example of how institutional effectiveness requires balancing respect for established procedures with willingness to recognize competence regardless of how it was acquired. The military, like any large organization, could achieve excellence only by finding ways to identify and utilize valuable capabilities wherever they existed, rather than limiting opportunities to people who fit predetermined categories. The lesson: wasn't that civilian experience was superior to military training, or that older equipment was better than newer systems. The lesson was that effectiveness required matching capabilities to requirements, rather than assuming that newest was always best or that credentials always indicated competence. In Sarah's case, 18 years of civilian work had provided exactly the combination of technical skill, problem-solving ability, and calm performance under pressure that proved essential when conventional approaches weren't adequate for the challenges at hand. 5 years after that stormy morning in Afghanistan, Sarah Mitchell stood in the same hangar where Desert Storm had once been scheduled for retirement. But now the space hummed with activity that would have been unimaginable during those early days when her expertise was dismissed and her background considered a liability. The hangar had been transformed into the Advanced Combat Aviation Training Center, a facility that drew pilots and maintenance personnel from across the military to learn approaches that combined traditional skills with modern technology in ways that maximized effectiveness rather than simply embracing the newest available systems. Desert Storm occupied the place of honor in the center of the facility, no longer bearing retirement tags but instead wearing the distinctive markings of an aircraft that had achieved legendary status within military aviation circles. Her hull showed the careful maintenance that came from being treated as a valuable training asset rather than obsolete equipment awaiting disposal. Students gathered around the helicopter daily, learning not just how to operate its systems but how to understand the philosophy that made older aircraft like the Apache effective in conditions where more sophisticated platforms struggled. Sarah's office overlooked the training floor from a mezzanine level that allowed her to observe instruction while remaining available for the administrative responsibilities that came with her current rank of Chief Warrant Officer. 4. The walls were lined with commendations and photographs that documented not just her own achievements, but the success of programs that had emerged from lessons learned during that critical mission to forward operating Base Phoenix. But the most meaningful decoration was a simple framed letter from Major Thompson, the base commander she'd helped rescue, thanking her for proving that courage and competence could overcome institutional inertia when lives were at stake. Training programs Sarah had developed attracted students whose backgrounds reflected the same diversity that had once made her suspect within traditional military culture. Former mechanics who'd learned aircraft systems through hands-on experience, rather than formal education. National Guard personnel who brought civilian expertise that complemented military training. International students from allied nations who operated older aircraft out of necessity and had discovered that necessity sometimes produced capabilities that weren't available through more conventional approaches. What unified these diverse students wasn't their credentials or their conformity to established patterns. What unified them was recognition that effective military aviation required understanding machines at a fundamental level that went beyond simply following procedures or relying on automated systems. Sarah's curriculum emphasized mechanical sympathy, the intuitive understanding that allowed pilots to recognize subtle changes in aircraft behavior that might indicate developing problems or opportunities for enhanced performance. The morning briefing that changed everything had taken place exactly 5 years earlier, but Sarah could still remember the weight of skepticism she'd faced when suggesting that a retired aircraft might be more suitable for certain missions than the systems being purchased to replace it. That skepticism had been rooted in assumptions about progress and modernization that treated newer as inherently better regardless of specific mission requirements or operational conditions. The subsequent investigation into systematic reliability issues had revealed problems that extended far beyond simple equipment failures. The military had been making procurement decisions based on theoretical capabilities rather than demonstrated performance under realistic conditions. Worse, institutional culture had discouraged the kind of critical evaluation that might have identified problems before they became operational liabilities. Sarah's analysis of supply chain patterns and maintenance reports had provided the foundation. for reforms that revolutionized how the military evaluated new technologies and assessed the continued value of existing systems. Instead of assuming that newer systems were automatically superior, evaluation protocols now required demonstration of improved performance under the full range of conditions where equipment might be deployed. Instead of dismissing older systems as obsolete, retirement decisions now required comprehensive analysis of whether their capabilities were being adequately replaced by proposed alternatives. The changes had implications that extended beyond aircraft procurement to encompass personnel, policies, and institutional culture. Sarah's success had demonstrated that valuable expertise could emerge from unconventional backgrounds, and that dismissing input based on credentials rather than content represented a form of institutional waste that undermined military effectiveness. Her story had become a case study in leadership schools, not because her background was particularly unusual, but because her treatment revealed assumptions about competence and value that were limiting organizational effectiveness. The transformation hadn't been immediate or universally welcomed. Institutional change within large organizations required overcoming resistance from people who'd built careers around existing approaches and who viewed challenges to established methods as personal criticism rather than opportunities for improvement. Captain Rodriguez had been quietly transferred to administrative duties where his preference for credential-based evaluation couldn't affect operational decisions. Colonel Hayes had been promoted to general and had become one of the military's most effective advocates for personnel policies that identified and utilized talent regardless of how it was developed. Lieutenant Davis had surprised everyone, including herself, by requesting assignment to Sarah's training program after completing her initial tour with more conventional units. The experience of watching Sarah succeed where established approaches had failed had challenged Davis's assumptions about the relationship between education and competence in ways that proved professionally transformative. She discovered that her formal training provided an excellent foundation for understanding aircraft systems, but that foundation needed to be supplemented with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from treating machines as partners rather than simply tools. Under Sarah's mentorship, Davis had developed into one of the military's most effective instructors for advanced helicopter operations. Her combination of formal education and practical wisdom made her particularly effective at teaching students who brought diverse backgrounds to aviation training. She'd learned to value experience regardless of how it was acquired and to recognize that competence could emerge from sources that traditional evaluation methods might overlook. The broader cultural shift within military aviation had attracted attention from civilian aviation authorities who were grappling with similar challenges related to over-reliance on automated systems and declining pilot skills in manual flight operations. Sarah had been invited to consult with airlines and aircraft manufacturers about training programs that maintained human capabilities alongside technological advancement. The lessons learned from her military experience were proving relevant to any organization that needed to balance innovation with preservation of fundamental skills. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible than new training programs or revised procurement policies. The military had begun to recognize that institutional effectiveness required creating space for voices that challenged conventional wisdom, even when those voices came from unexpected sources. Sarah's story had demonstrated that valuable insights could emerge from people whose backgrounds didn't fit traditional patterns, and that organizational excellence required listening to those insights rather than dismissing them based on their source. The morning Sarah received notification of her pending promotion to the senior warrant officer ranks, she took a walk around the perimeter of Fort Carson that followed the same route she'd jogged during those early days when her future seemed limited to processing retirement paperwork for aircraft she believed still had value to offer. The base looked much the same, but her perspective had been transformed by experiences that proved preparation could create opportunities that couldn't be anticipated or planned. Her children, now in college, had grown up watching their mother demonstrate that competence could overcome institutional prejudice and that persistence could eventually create space for contributions that weren't initially welcomed or understood. They'd learned lessons about the value of preparation, the importance of standing up for principles, even when doing so carried professional risks, and the possibility that individual action could influence institutional change in ways that benefited people far beyond the immediate actors. Sarah's father would have been proud to see what his daughter had accomplished, though he might not have been surprised. He'd taught her that machines responded to understanding rather than authority, that competence was more important than credentials, and that valuable work often went unrecognized until circumstances created situations where its value became undeniable. Those lessons, learned in a civilian garage, while working on helicopters that most people considered obsolete, had proven applicable to challenges that neither father nor daughter could have anticipated. The evening news report that brought national attention to Sarah's story had focused on the dramatic rescue mission and the success of an aircraft that had been scheduled for retirement. But Sarah understood that the real story was less dramatic and more fundamental. It was about the importance of recognizing value wherever it existed, the danger of dismissing capabilities based on surface appearances, and the possibility that institutional effectiveness could be enhanced by creating space for diverse perspectives and unconventional approaches. Desert Storm had been returned to flight status and had subsequently flown hundreds of training missions that prepared new pilots for the kind of challenging conditions where automated systems might not be adequate and where manual skills could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The aircraft had proven its worth not through a single dramatic mission, but through consistent performance that demonstrated the continued relevance of capabilities that others had considered outdated. Sarah's own career had followed a similar pattern. Her value hadn't been established through credentials or formal qualifications, but through demonstrated competence under conditions that revealed the limitations of more conventional approaches. She'd proven that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, and that institutional effectiveness required recognizing and utilizing that expertise, regardless of how it was developed. The training center that bore her name would continue operating long after her retirement, staffed by instructors who understood that military aviation required both technological sophistication and fundamental skills that couldn't be automated or programmed. Students would continue learning that effective flying required understanding aircraft as mechanical systems that responded to competent operation rather than simply as platforms for sophisticated technologies that handled most operational challenges automatically. But the most important legacy wasn't institutional or organizational. It was personal. Sarah had demonstrated that individual preparation and competence could create opportunities to contribute meaningfully to challenges that mattered, even when institutional systems initially failed to recognize or utilize available capabilities. She'd proven that background and credentials were less important than character and competence, and that persistence could eventually create space for contributions that weren't initially welcomed or understood. The young woman who'd spent 18 years working multiple jobs to support her family while dreaming of opportunities that seemed permanently out of reach had become a senior military officer whose expertise was sought by organizations around the world. But more importantly, she'd become an example of how individual excellence could influence institutional change and how preparation could create readiness for opportunities that couldn't be predicted or planned. On quiet evenings when the training center was closed and Desert Storm sat silently in her hangar, Sarah sometimes reflected on the chain of events that had transformed her from a dismissed maintenance sergeant into a respected leader whose approach to aviation training was reshaping military culture. The transformation hadn't happened because she'd sought recognition or challenged authority for its own sake. It had happened because she'd prepared herself for opportunities to contribute, and had been willing to take professional risks when circumstances demanded capabilities that others couldn't provide. The lesson wasn't that civilian experience was superior to military training, or that older systems were better than newer ones. The lesson was that effectiveness required matching capabilities to requirements rather than assuming that established approaches were automatically optimal for all conditions. Sometimes the most valuable contributions came from sources that institutional systems weren't designed to recognize, and sometimes the most effective solutions involved resources that conventional wisdom considered obsolete or inappropriate. Sarah's story had become part of military folklore, retold in leadership classes and training programs, as an example of how individual initiative could overcome institutional inertia when lives were at stake. But she understood that the real significance of her experience lay not in its dramatic elements, but in its demonstration that preparation and competence could create opportunities for meaningful contribution, regardless of background or credentials. The 18 years she'd spent working civilian jobs hadn't been wasted time or irrelevant experience. They'd been preparation for challenges she couldn't have anticipated, developing skills and perspectives that would prove essential when circumstances demanded capabilities that weren't available through more conventional sources. Every difficult customer at the diner had taught her patience under pressure. Every equipment failure at the gas station had developed her mechanical problem-solving abilities. Every thankless shift in supply warehouses had reinforced her understanding that valuable work often went unrecognized until circumstances revealed its importance. Most importantly, those civilian years had taught her that competence was its own reward, and that preparation created readiness for opportunities that might never come, but that, when they did come, could justify years of patient development. Sarah had spent her entire adult life preparing for the moment when someone would need exactly the combination of skills, experience, and judgment that she'd developed through circumstances that others considered disadvantageous. When that moment finally arrived, she'd been ready. And that readiness had made all the difference, not just for her own career, but for the people whose lives had depended on capabilities that institutional systems had written off as obsolete. The rescue of Forward Operating Base Phoenix had required exactly the kind of simple, reliable competence that couldn't be programmed or automated, and Sarah had been prepared to provide it when more sophisticated approaches proved inadequate. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her career, which would involve training the next generation of military aviators who would face challenges that couldn't yet be anticipated, she carried forward lessons that applied far beyond aviation or military service. Excellence required preparation that went beyond formal requirements. Effectiveness required recognizing value regardless of its source. And institutional success required creating space for contributions that didn't fit established patterns, but that might prove essential when circumstances demanded capabilities that weren't available through conventional approaches. The young recruits who would learn to fly under her guidance would discover that mastering aircraft systems required more than memorizing procedures or relying on automated technologies. They'd learn that effective aviation required developing relationships with machines that responded to understanding rather than authority, and that competence under challenging conditions came from preparation that went beyond minimum requirements. But most importantly, they'd learn that their own backgrounds and experiences, however unconventional, could provide valuable perspectives that enhanced rather than limited their military effectiveness. Sarah's example would show them that institutional excellence required diversity of thought and experience, and that the most valuable contributions often came from people whose qualifications couldn't be measured by traditional standards. The hangar lights dimmed automatically as evening settled over Fort Carson, leaving Desert Storm silhouetted against windows that reflected the lights of a base that continued operating around the clock to prepare for challenges that couldn't be fully anticipated. Somewhere in the distance, other aircraft were taking off and landing, crewed by pilots whose training reflected lessons learned from Sarah's experience and whose capabilities had been enhanced by understanding that effectiveness required both technological sophistication and fundamental skills that couldn't be replaced by automation. Sarah's journey from civilian struggling to make ends meet through multiple part-time jobs to senior military officer responsible for training programs that influenced aviation culture worldwide had demonstrated that individual preparation and institutional excellence were connected in ways that benefited everyone involved. Her success hadn't come at anyone else's expense. Instead, it had created opportunities and capabilities that enhanced organizational effectiveness while proving that valuable contributions could emerge from the most unexpected sources. The story that had begun with dismissal and skepticism had evolved into an example of how individual excellence and institutional effectiveness could reinforce each other when organizations were wise enough to recognize and utilize capabilities regardless of how they were developed. Sarah Mitchell had proven that 18 years of part-time jobs could indeed prepare someone to turn the course of a war, but only if someone was prepared to look beyond credentials to recognize competence wherever it existed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.